Hey friend, Chris Vandeviver here from WhyLogicProRules.com, the website that helps you get the most you can out of Apple's Logic Pro 10. Today we're finally detouring from the 10.5 update, and I wanted to show you an idea that I came across that really helped me out with some drum mixes for a record. Now, the last couple of weeks I've been mixing a record for a client of mine, and I love the songs and I love the recordings, but specifically with the drums, we have some home recorded drums, or maybe in a rehearsal space or what have you, recorded in a project studio environment. And sometimes our drum tracks can come out sounding amazing, and sometimes they need a little massaging, a little help to get to the place that it needs to go. Now, with these particular drums, I found them to be sort of muddy, specifically the snare drum and the kick drum. And I ended up using a very unlikely processor to kind of get them out of the doldrums and get them to where they need to go. And I want to demonstrate this processor to you right now. Now, these are live recorded drums, but that doesn't mean this tactic is only applicable to multi-tracked live recorded drums. This could be for your electronic drums or hip hop drums or whatever the case may be. But this tactic is to help drums kind of get out of the doldrums, help them get that articulation, that aggression, that pop that they need to stick out in the mix. So let me just show you the drums as is right now. And let me show you what I started with. So I'm going to select each of the kick tracks and the snare tracks. And you can see that I have an instance of Amp Designer on each of these drum tracks. Not the toms. I felt that they were quite good enough. Overheads, hi-hats, very happy with. But specifically the kick and snare, I was chasing my tail a lot using EQ. And sometimes EQ can take you where you need to go. And sometimes you just end up chasing your tail and you're like, doesn't matter how much high end or upper mids that I introduce, doesn't matter how much mud I cut out, I'm just not getting what I need out of these drums. So let's bypass Amp Designer and check it out now. Not inspiring, right? So check it out. For the snare drum here, and I think just across the board, let's open the kick drum as well. Okay, slightly different. I'm using Amp Designer without any sort of cabinet after the amp. Now, this idea might kind of fly in the face of what you think. You think a guitar amp, maybe distortion, might be too aggressive for a drum track. But with a snare and kick here, we have a situation where the drum is pretty muddy, and no matter how much I boost with the EQ, I'm just not going to get that articulation and that snap and that aggression. By using Amp Designer, we can actually kind of reshape the tone of this instrument just by pushing the instrument through the amp itself, the amp circuit. Now, I have not adjusted anything having to do with the EQ in terms of what style of EQ. I just flipped through the amp heads, and I decided the small tweed amp was a really good fit. I messed really just with the tone knobs and the presence knob. I've got the master cranked all the way up, but I brought the output down to compensate. And I played with the gain because I'm not interested in creating a very distorted snare track. I just want some snap to it. So check it out. Let's just set everything to 0. And let's hear just the snare track here. And if we compare, cool. So we're boosting the bass quite a bit because I didn't want to lose the body of the snare. After that, I'm reducing the mids. We're reducing the mids to try to remove some of that mud of the snare. And then we're adding a lot of treble and presence. So we're essentially using it as an EQ plugin. But by running this snare drum through the amp emulation, we're getting an added benefit of the tonal shift of just running it through an amp emulation. So check it out. Once again, if we set these all to 12 o'clock and I bypass, let's flip through some of these modes. So all of the other modes seem a little too aggressive, right? And let's play with the gain here. The gain is kind of operating as like a compressor, because it's pushing the snare drum more and more into the ceiling of this amp. Not all amps work well in this situation, in my humble opinion. If I use some of the more high octane heads, I don't think I'm going to like the results. Yeah, that's just god awful. But more of these clean type of heads work really well for adjusting the tone and giving aggression and articulation. And then I copied and pasted the same amp head to the bottom snare mic. So check it out. But I adjusted the tone subtly. So, less bass, a little more gain. Take a look at the presence knob. That's identical. Just a tiny bit less master. I probably didn't even notice that when I was working on it. And then with the kick drum, I went with a different amp head. So the mini tweed amp. I tend to like kick drums that are very punchy, very clicky. The client wasn't so interested in that sound, so I had to kind of back off on those ideas. You can see that I left the treble and the presence alone, and I boosted the bass and the mids, and the gain just a hair. So let's check it out. Do you notice that even though I have the bass boosted, the mids boosted, there's still a roll off in the very bottom of the kick. It doesn't feel as boomy as it does without the amp emulation. Now, let's also point out that I have the exciter here to try to add a little more presence and articulation on this drum. If I remove it, check it out. Not present and aggressive enough for me particularly. So I bring it in. It's a subtle lift, it's just 10% in harmonics, 2K and above, but it does a lot. So let's bring in that bottom kick drum. Once again, Amp Designer, same settings just about. Now, not that inspiring by itself, but then when we introduce it with the full kit here. Huge difference. Our drum kit sounds 100% less muddy now. That kick drum is way more in the pocket. It's been rolled off in the very bottom. It has less of that boomy nature. The snare drum actually has articulation and snap instead of sounding like kind of a muddy, cardboardy sound. This was an idea that I stumbled across and I was like, yeah, that's an interesting idea. Let me give it a try. And I loved the results. So I'm definitely going to keep this in my back pocket. Again, whether you work on electronic music, hip hop, whatever, I think this is still applicable. It's easy to overlook tools like Amp Designer and Pedal Board and Bass Amp Designer as just guitar tools. But what I'm finding is that these tools are not just for guitars, and that's why it's very interesting that many of the electronic drum kits and synths in Logic actually include Amp Designer, Pedal Board. I do hope this was helpful for you. If it was, as always, I highly suggest subscribing to the YouTube channel, Why Logic Pro Rules, or subscribing on the website itself, whylogicprorules.com. Every week I'm posting new videos, new emails, and posts to help you get the most you can out of Apple's Logic Pro 10. Thanks so much.